Hey, today we're going to code this beautiful numeric input without any libraries, just native HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. As you can see, we will have this beautiful 3D transition from one state to the other, but it's also very accessible. So it's not just beautiful, it's also really accessible. I can change the numbers from here, and it just works. I can just control it from the keyboard. All good. So this is what we're going to code today. First thing you might ask is, Lucas, where would I possibly need such thing? Well, my first initial thought process was to use this in e-commerce carts. So the idea would be in an e-commerce cart, you always have an option to increase the quantity of each of the items that you had selected to put in your cart. And I thought that this would be just a nice detail to have in an e-commerce so that people can control the quantity of their items. But honestly, you can use this for any place where you need a numeric input for integers. Maybe you could also do it for floating point numbers, but this was initially intended for integers. So let's get to it. I do have the code all done here on CodePen, but I am not gonna start with that because what would be the fun in that, right? So bye-bye. Let's just start from scratch. But before we start from scratch, let me give credits where credit is due. This whole idea was actually inspired by a CodePen that I found from Oleg Frolov. I think that's the right way to say it. And he did something extremely similar. But I did notice that there were some accessibility issues, like I couldn't just change the number from directly typing the value. And also just keyboard navigation would be a little funky. So I wanted to do something different. But honestly, like the whole animation idea and the way that it works using CSS, that's all Oleg. I just added some other accessibility flavors to it and changed the design a little bit to appeal for my taste. But the original idea was from Oleg Frolov. Even the design itself, I wasn't the one that did it. I asked my team at Envoy and they gave to me this design, which would be, this would be the default state. And then we would have here the state for focused elements. So when an element is in focus, this would be the style of the outline. So shout out to the designers at Envoy. Thank you for making everything that I do look better. Quite frankly, I'm a great developer, not such a great designer, but thank God that I have great designers on my team. So let's get started. I said that I wouldn't use the things that I have created before, and that is true, but I will be copy and pasting some things here just so that I don't forget about them. So for example, the references, I think this is important to have right in the beginning. So I copy and pasted that here. So you can just, if you want to look at the Figma file, I made it open for public, so you can just go into this URL and try to code it yourself, I guess, if you want to try that out. If I were to explain every single thing in how this code works, the focus of the video would be lost because we would be spending a lot more time talking about all the other supportive CSS styles than the actual thing that matters the most. So again, I will also copy and paste those supportive things, but I will explain each one of them, okay? This is the HTML. I know, it's a lot. But let me explain to you what we have here. Let me close everything else. So I'm gonna also collapse those buttons. So the way that this works is we always have a front face and a back face. So imagine that this is an actual 3D element. Let me see if I can have something here, whatever. Like, okay, this thing here, this is a box, right? Okay, but imagine that it's just like a piece of paper. And then we have the front face and we have back face. So what we're about to do in our code is we're going to create an element to represent the front face, and we will create another element to represent the back face. And then we are going to do an animation that spins in the direction that we clicked. So this is your left, right? I'm looking at the camera, so I might be wrong, but assuming that this is the left side, so this will have the minus icon, and this, which is the right side, will have the plus icon. When we click on the plus, we want to rotate it in this direction, but when we click on the minus, we want to rotate it in the direction where you clicked. So minus rotates to this side, plus rotates to this other side. That's how it works. And how do we translate that into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? I imagine that are other ways to do it too, but the way that I did it was I created two elements, one to represent the front face and another to represent the back face. And I put both of them inside a container. And I also created a data initial value attribute to set the initial value of the input. So this input would start with the value 200. If I wanted it to start with the value 900, I would just change this to 900. And if I don't set anything, then it would start with 0. All right. How about the structure inside front and the back? What do we have here? We actually have the exact same structure. So if we were doing this using a JavaScript framework such as Angular, Vue, React, or whatever, then this would be much, much, much easier, because instead of me having to repeat this in the HTML, which looks terrible, I would just have a component that deals with this, and then I could somehow have, like, let's say that I'm creating this component for Envoid, so I would have Envoid numeric cart input, and then in Angular, this would be the component. And then I could, if we're talking about Angular, then I would be able to pass a form control to it and control its value, just like any kinds of elements where we want to use them in forms. But since I wanted to use vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so that we didn't have all the burden of only talking to people that know a particular framework, since I didn't want that problem, so we are having the issue of duplicating content manually. But that's okay. Like, if you are using a JavaScript framework, you will know how to optimize this. Everything that I have in front, I also have in back. It's the exact same thing, okay? Like, I will expand one of them and just one because the other is exactly the same. There's absolutely nothing different. The only difference is that one has the class back and the other has the class front, just that. I have a button with a class called decrement and another button with a class called increment and an input in the middle with the class value. And this is an input of type number. This is important because if you access this input from your cell phone, then if it's a type number, then the keyboard of your cell phone will only show numbers, which is a much better experience than if you used type text and then you would see all the different characters. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So just to make it clear, there might be different operating systems where you will use type number, but still you're gonna see all the other characters. Sorry about that. If we open up the button with the class decrement, it simply has an SVG inside of it. And where did I got this SVG from? I got it from the Figma file here. So basically on Figma, you can simply select the element and then you can export it as SVG. So I did that. And then I threw the SVG directly here, remove some of the unnecessary properties that came with it because it also came with like a fill, which was using like white. I didn't need that because I was setting that in the CSS. It also came with the height, 48 pixels. And it also came with width of 48 pixels. All of those things, I was already setting them in the CSS, so we didn't need to have them on the HTML, so I just removed them. And on the increment, we have the same structure, so it's an SVG, but in this case, it's an SVG for the plus icon. And on the decrement is an SVG for the minus icon. Just that. This is the HTML. No secrets. I am going to duplicate this, and I want to have two elements, one with an initial value of 200 and another with an initial value of 400. this is all for the HTML. So for now on, I won't be using the HTML as much, so I will collapse it for now. But just remember that the link for this CodePen will be in the description. So if you want to take a closer look in the HTML, see how everything's working, you can do so. Now let's go to the CSS. I will do the same thing. I will copy some of the styles that are not important for the main task of this video, and I will explain them to you. First, reset CSS. So here on CodePen, I can just click here on CSS base and select reset, but this doesn't reset everything. I actually had to include some other properties to leave everything in the way that I wanted. And the properties were actually, I'm even missing like input here. Okay. So why did I need those properties? Because even using the CSS reset that CodePen gives me, like it still gives a particular background color and a border to the buttons, which I don't want. So I just fully removed it. Let me comment this code out so that you can see what I mean. Can you see that like it's kind of grayish and there's a border and it's not using the cursor pointer, it's using the normal pointer? I don't like that for buttons. This code is removing that, removing the border, and boom, now the button is completely transparent because by default it shouldn't have any color. And as you can see, when I hover over the invisible button, my mouse actually turns into a cursor pointer, which indicates that it is something that you can click on, which I think is ideal for buttons. Now, those things here are so that I can remove the default browser controls for numeric inputs. If I don't have that, the browser is going to include these controls here so that you can manage the numeric input. We won't need this because we will create our own controls. So in order to remove that, I have these styles. Don't think much about it. Honestly, like whenever I have such situations, I just look up on the internet. How can I remove the default styles, the default browser styles for X thing? Then I just find the answer and copy and paste, because this code here, it's like not something that you should memorize, okay? One thing missing here is the input actually has a border and a background, and I don't want it. So I would just remove this here. So border 0, background none. Awesome. Now we can't see anything, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to reset all the styles, which means that now everything is white or transparent or has no border, etc., which means that I can't really see anything, but the elements are here. So now we're going to start styling them. Okay, let's go into the more supportive styles, because thus far we were just doing reset styles. Now let's get into the supportive. And here we go. Okay. Okay, now it's a lot of things happening here. Now this is, at least I can understand what's going on. At least I can see something, which is better. But now you might be asking, what happened? What did I paste it here? So first thing, I pasted a script that uses Mongo Grotesque. So this is a custom web font, and the designers at Envoy used that font for the numbers inside the input. So I needed to include that font in the code. So I did that here, declaring it with the font face declaration. I was only able to do this because I'm using CodePen Pro, and then I can upload some assets to CodePen. So I uploaded this font, and CodePen gave me this URL, which I can use to just reference that font. Besides that, I'm also making some changes to the body. So I'm setting this beautiful background because by default it's just a normal white background, and I wanted something different. So I used this color. I am using a trick that I already explained in previous videos. So I'm putting a link to my previous videos somewhere around here or in the description. So you can go into any of these videos and I can explain exactly how this trick works to centralize the elements on the screen. I'm not going to go over it again just because I already said that in the past 3 videos and it would get pretty repetitive. I'm setting a padding of 24 pixels in the top and in the bottom. Boxes in border box, also explained in the last video. Check it out on YouTube. And setting gap 32 pixels so that I have 32 pixels of distance between each element inside the body. My numeric card input will use this particular color here. This is really cool actually. I wrote the code in such a way that if I change the color, it not only changes the color of the input, but it also changes the color of the icons. So that's another interesting detail which makes my life easier. I just have to set the color and it just cascades down, which is how CSS should be. I am also applying some styles to the front and the back elements of the numeric card input. So this where declaration here applies this CSS rules to the front element inside numeric card input and also to the back element inside the numeric card input. It's just a nicer way to write it. Otherwise, I would have to repeat the code twice. So I'm just setting a background color, display flags, gap 16 pixels between those three elements, the buttons and the input in the middle. I'm centralizing the items horizontally and vertically, adding some padding, some border to look pretty, and that's basically that. Now this is for the bottom icons, so 48 pixels of height and width for these icons, 100% border radius so that they become a circle. The color I am inheriting from the parent. The fill, which is the color of the SVGs, is the current color, and the color is inherited, so the color of the parent will be the color of the SVGs. Then display flags, justify content, align items just to centralize the icons. Because if you don't do that, then you can have some very, very small details that I notice and they bug me out. And then it doesn't get perfectly centered, which annoys me. This is how you get things to be perfectly centered. Then if I am hovering, then I should have this other shadow of gray here, just to indicate that I can actually click on this thing. The one in the middle doesn't need it because it's always with this background, but you could also change that. You could say that the input doesn't have this background, but then if you hover, then it shows this background, wherever you want. Then I'm actually using the Mango Grotesque font that I installed. I'm saying that the width of my entire card should be 192 pixels. This is aligned with the design specification that I got on Figma. The minimum height should be 96 pixels. The font size is 5 rand. Like all of those things, I'm just setting the things that the designer intended for me to do on the Figma file. So if you just check the Figma file, you will see those properties there. And this one here, I'm just changing the color of the default outline. So if you just click tab on your keyboard, you will be able to tab through the elements on the page. And I actually wanted this green color. I didn't want it the default, which is that blue color. So if I comment this out, you'll be able to see this is the default one. I didn't want it that. Actually, the designer didn't want it that, and I agree. The green one looks way cooler. So this is what this is doing here. These are the supportive CSS styles. Now, let's get to the main content. Let's go into the main styles. And this one here, I will take some reference from my second monitor here on the left, which has the entire code running, but I will code this from scratch with all of you so that you can see line by line how this works. Okay, first things first, I will select the numeric card input. I will make it position relative. Why? Because I need the back face, which is the element below. Like you can see these groups of two elements, then two elements. The element below is actually the back face. So I need to somehow glue the back face there. I want to use position absolute in the back face so that I can remove the size that it's taking up here. And since it has all the same properties as the front face, it will have the same size. So I can just use position absolute and you will not notice that there's an element behind the front because it has the exact same dimensions. Let me do that, and then I'll get the numeric cart input. Numeric cart input back. I will make it position absolute. And top 0, left 0. Okay, now we only have, or at least we can only see the front-facing element, but the back one is actually there. Like, how can I say that? Because here I am tabbing. I don't know if you can notice, but here, I'm here. If I press tab again, you would expect it to go to the minus below. But if I press tab, it just goes to some magical place. Where is it? Right now, it is focused on an element which is in the back side of this container. So it's still there, and this is actually an accessibility problem, and we will deal with this later because the user should be able to see the things that are being focused. So this is a problem, but we're going to fix this later. Now, let me actually rotate those elements because the back face should be rotated and glued to the back. It's already glued to the back, but it's front to front. It should be front and back. To do that, I will use transform rotate Y and set it to rotate 180 degrees. Again, you can't see it because it's in the back, but now it is rotated. How do you know? Let me remove the position absolute and then we can check it. Yeah, it is rotated. See, like even the numbers here, they are rotated. So yeah, this one below is definitely rotated. Now let's turn back position absolute so that it goes to the back. All right. Now, just for the sake of seeing what we're doing, let's actually rotate the container element so that we see if this is working as we intended. So I'm going to use transform rotate, but I'm actually just going to put like 70 degrees here. And yeah, this is not the effect that I showed in the beginning. And the reason for that is because of the perspective. Remember, this is the 3D element that we are trying to simulate. Here, if there's a distance between me and the element, then when it spins, I will have an effect. If the element is really far, like really far away, then the effect will be different because the perspective is different. Now, the problem is that by default, the perspective is 0 pixels. So the element is like this. The element is literally on your face. So when you spin this thing on your face, you can't really see a beautiful effect because it's in your face. So let's change that. In the body, which is the parent element of the numeric cart input, I will set perspective to 300 pixels. Now we have it. And just so that you can see the effect that the perspective has, let's change the perspective a bit. I'm decreasing the perspective, and as I decrease the perspective, it's like your eyes are getting closer to the element, and then it's like this ugly thing. But if your eyes are more distant, then you can actually see the effect. So I'm just gonna use 300 pixels because it's just a number that I felt had a nice effect on it. Let's keep that. So we can see that this is working, but if we spin it completely, does it only show the back face? Let's check. Okay, this is the back. And this is weird. It's showing the back in the front and what's going on? Okay, the thing is, by default, you will be able to see the element in both faces. So if I get this thing here and I invert this, you will still be able to see it, but inverted. Now, we don't really want that. we want this to be a face that has only one direction. Like what I mean is, if you look in the back, it should be invisible. Like the back face of the element should be invisible. Only the front face should be visible. And how can we do that? There's actually a CSS property just for that. So numeric cart input. I'm going to get the front and the back. And there's a property called backface visibility. I love those names. It's so clear, like it's exactly what we want. And I want to say that the backface visibility is hidden. So the back face of these elements will not be shown. Now, if I rotate the element, we can still see it. Why can we still see this thing? Well, the reason for that is that by default, since we are messing with the rotate property in the parent element, then this is creating a 3D space for the parent element. And when we do that, it flattens the 3D space of the children elements. So remember that we got the back element and we rotated the back element? Well, we lost that because we rotated the container element that contains the back. We can fix that, and it's pretty easy actually. I am going to show you a page from MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, which goes in detail into how this works. Super interesting. I love Mozilla Developer Network. So what we need is the transform style property, and their description is great. The transform style CSS property sets whether children of an element are positioned in the 3D space or are flattened in the plane of the element. So do we want to flatten the children of our container element into the 3D space of the container element, or do we want the container element to be in the 3D space, but the children to also be in the 3D space? We want the second one. So we need to change this because by default, the default value is flat. And this is going to flatten. See here, like flat, then the element is flattened in the 3D space of the parent. And then preserve is going to make sure that the childrens of the parent element are still in their 3D space. So this is the one that we need. So transform style preserve 3D. Now, when I rotate this thing here, boom, there's nothing here because now you're only seeing the back. And here, now you're only seeing the front. So now it's working as we intended. By the way, let's do a short pause here and talk about how the hell did I got to learn all those things? And how can you learn those things too? Because here, sure, we're talking about like a really cool usage of 3D animations, but like, what if you want to do something different than what we're doing here? What if the things that I covered here were not enough for you to know how to fix your problem? Well, this is the perfect scenario for you to go check out my course on web animations. It's not currently released at the moment that I'm recording this video, but I do have a waiting list open. And if you join the waiting list, you will guarantee a huge discount for when the course launches. If you want to join the waiting list, you can go to lucaspaganini.com/webanimations. And in this page, you will be able to see more information about the course, what are the modules, what it proposes to teach. But basically, it's a course for you to feel really confident on your web animations. It's a course where you will learn the fundamentals, all the technologies that exist, and then you'll be able to code your own web animations. Okay, what else do we need to do here? Well, honestly, not much, but the transition here is not very smooth. What I mean is that we will be later using JavaScript to change the rotation of the parent container. So JavaScript will do this turn here, And right now, if we just change the value from 0 to 300 to 180, it will just change instantly. We don't want that. We want a smooth transition. So let's do that here. Let's add a transition. And let's say that we want to transition the transform property 500 milliseconds using the ease timing function. All those things are covered in my web animations course if you want to learn even more about timing functions and transitions, etc. Another thing is, sure, we want this smooth transition. This is the thing that made you be interested in the video, I assume, but there will always be users that don't want a lot of motion because they literally have motion sickness. If your website has a lot of motion, they are just gonna get dizzy. It's not gonna be a good experience for them. So for accessibility reasons, I will disable the transition if the user has a flag in their operating system saying that they prefer to have reduced motion. That's actually a real thing, like MDN prefers reduced motion. Here, again, love MDN. There's an entire article about how you can use this and why does it exist, what's the importance of this. But basically, just like you can have media queries for minimum width and etc., you can also have media queries for that functionality, for prefers reduced motion. Here, what I'm going to do is, if the user prefers reduced motion, I will have no transition in the numeric cart input. That was everything for the HTML and CSS. Now we gotta go into the JavaScript. But before that, I will remove this rotate Y 70 degrees because I was just using that so that we could see what we were doing, but we don't need it anymore. So let's close the CSS tab. I'm actually also gonna close these other tabs. And let's worry about the JavaScript now. I am going to copy the JavaScript that I already did, but I will walk you through it line by line so that you understand how this works. I'm gonna copy and paste because there's a lot of things here, and quite frankly, I think the video will be too long and you will just get bored if you just watch me doing this from scratch. Okay, first we have this utility function here. Basically, this is a pipe function, and I use it down below here. And then basically, like, I give an initial value, and then it takes an infinite array of functions to apply to this initial value. So this initial value will be applied to this function here, and then the result of this function will be applied in this other function here. So it's just a beautiful way for you to concatenate and apply your functions. Now let's focus on the main code. I'm going to collapse the implementation for now, but basically it's a function called create numeric cart input. This function will take a host element and it will apply all the functionalities to this host element. So what will be the host element? Of course, that it will be the elements with the class numeric cart input. So we have to select all the elements that have this class and call this function with them. Imagine that this is a class and then we're instantiating the component. So I'm doing this here. I'm initiating here. So I get the document. I use query selector all to get all the elements that match this query. This is going to give me an array of elements. For each element, I will pass them through a function. The function will be create numeric cart input. So this is the same thing as saying like element and calling the function with the element. But I don't need to do this. I can just pass the function directly, which is much more beautiful. This is functional programming, which is another thing that I love. So if you want me to do a course on this, then comment functional programming. And who knows, maybe if there's enough people wanting me to teach about it, I can also do a course about it. Now, let's get into the actual implementations of how this works. Let me also show you to you that it does work. So the functionalities here are, if I click on the minus, it decreases the number and it spins from the left. If I click on the plus, it increases and spins from the right, and I can also change the number directly, and it also works properly. Okay, so how this implementation actually works, that's another magic, right? I mean, the main magic of this video was in the CSS, but JavaScript is also interesting, right? So let's get to it. First, I am setting a variable called current value, and this is a type number. I just made this annotation for myself just to make it clear that this is a number. Since I can't use TypeScript here, then at least I can have type annotations. And to do that, I am getting the host element data set, and this gives me access to all the properties in my element which start with data hyphen, and of course that I have the initial value property, because if you look at the HTML, we have here data initial value, and then I can access that using JavaScript by accessing the data set. And then if this exists, which it will, but anyways, let's check, then I'll access the initial value property. If this property is not available, then I'm using the nullish coalescent operator to convert this into 0. And then I'll parse this int. If for some reason this gives me nan, which is not a number, then I will use the OR operator to convert this to 0. So basically we get the number that is in the data initial value property attribute, but if we can't, then we just use 0 as the initial value. I have some functions inside this other function. So I have one function which gets the current rotation. And how does this work? I am getting the transform property in the host element, and by default the transform property will be empty. There will be nothing to it. I will try to apply this into this function, and this function has this regular expression. This regular expression will try to extract the rotate value, and it will try to extract the amount of degrees that I'm using in the rotate y function in the host element style transform property. Okay, is that confusing? I imagine so. Let me explain to you in practice. Open RegEx 101. Okay, so this is the regular expression. Let's say that the host element has the transform property on CSS, and the value is rotate 100 degrees. Then the regular expression will match, and there is a group here in the regular expression, and this group is exactly to get the amount of degrees. Can you see that this part is in green? Since this part is in green, I will be able to access that as being the first group. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if I open the console here and I use this regular expression, I execute this regular expression against the string rotate y 100 degrees, then this will give me as a return an object, and I can access the element with the number 1, and this will be the value of the group 1, which is this group here that I'm declaring in the regular expression. If I use a negative number, this also works. So let me use like negative like 999. Then this also works here. I can get the negative 999. So I'm using this regular expression. Then I'm accessing the property 1, but I am also using this operator here so that if the regex fails, for example, if the host element is running for the first time, it doesn't have the transform property set to rotate y, so it will be empty. And if it's empty, then the regular expression will fail and it will return null instead of an object. If it returns null, then I can't access the property number 1. This will throw an error. So I'm using this optional chaining operator to see if it is not nullable, and if it is not nullable, then it means that it succeeded, and then I access the value of the group 1. If not, then I just use the string 0. And then afterwards, I use the parse int function so that I can convert the string into an integer. So this function here does all those things, but basically it returns to me the number of degrees that the host element is being rotated. Okay, that's the responsibility of this function. Then I have this other function which gets the current face, and basically it gives me a string which is either front or back, and this tells me which side of the element is facing forward. So is the back facing forward or is the front facing forward? This function tells me that. How does it work? I call get current rotation, which I just explained. I use the rest operator with the value 360. And what this is going to do is it's going to remove all values that exceed 360. So imagine that like the value is 361. Then this is going to return just the number 1 instead of 361. And then I divide this by 180 and I round this return. So why am I doing all this? Because how can I know which face is forward? I know this with the rotation. Like if it is 0 degrees, then the front face is forward. If it's 180 degrees, then the back face is forward. And this is what I'm calculating here. I divide this by 180 so that I only have a value that is closer to 0 or a value that is closer to 1. And then I use mat round to round this to either 0 or 1. And I use this bang bang here to convert this into a Boolean. So if it is 0, it will be converted into false. If it is 1, it will be converted into true. And then if it is false, if it is true, then the back is facing forward. Why? Because it's closer to 180 degrees than it is to 0 degrees. And if it's closer to 180 degrees, then it means that the back is facing forward. If this returns true, then this function returns the string back. But if it returns false, then it returns the string front. This is how this function works. If it's still confusing, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to explain it better. In any case, you can also play with the code and try to understand how this is working. Other than that, I'm setting the initial values. So in the HTML, we set the initial value to 200 or 400. And here I am actually populating that in the inputs, because if I don't do that, then what is going to happen is there will be nothing. And then 201 suddenly. So I actually need to populate the initial values so that you can actually see the value that you want it to be the initial value. I also need to listen to changes in the numeric input and update the current value accordingly. Why? Because I don't want to just control using plus and minus. I also want to be able to change the number here. So for me to be able to do that, I need to listen to change events in this input. And if a change event occurs, then I update the current value variable. So query selector all, I get all the elements, I get all the inputs. Then for each input, I add the event listener of change. And when a change happens, I get the new value. I use parseInt to convert that into an integer. And I update the current value variable accordingly. Oh no, I had to make a cut because the battery of one of the cameras ran out. Sorry, but yeah, let's get back to it. So I believe we were at this stage. So I just explained how we listen to changes on the value input and update the current value accordingly. Now, the second thing is a function. The next thing would be a function that is called activate face. And this is for accessibility reasons. The idea is, remember when I was saying that we shouldn't be able to focus on the elements that we can't see. We should only focus on the elements that we can see. This is what this function does. So I give it a face that should be activated, and it turns all the things that I can focus inside that face into things that I can focus, and the thing that is in the back, I turn all their elements into things that I cannot focus just using the keyboard. And how do I do that? Using tab index. So I either set tab index to 0, and that makes the element focusable, or I set tab index to -1, and that makes the element not focusable. And then I call it initially with front. So this is because initially the front is the one that is facing forward, and the back is the one that is facing backwards. And so I call this function initially with the value front, and what this is going to do is it's going to activate the elements that are in the front, and it's going to deactivate the elements that are in the other face, which is the back. So the result of this is that here, if I just click tab from my keyboard, as soon as I got here, if I press again, I go downwards. Remember, we couldn't do that before. When I were here and I pressed tab before, the tab would just go to Narnia. It would go to a magical place that we don't know where it was. And in fact, it was going to the back of our element, which we couldn't see. Now, the back of our element is not something that we can focus. It's not from the keyboard. It's not something that we can just click tab on the keyboard and go to it, which is intended. So this is what this function does. And of course, we need to call it whenever we rotate too. So when I rotate here, now the back should be activated, and the front, which is currently on the back, should be deactivated. And we're going to talk about how I'm doing this now. I have this rotate function. The rotate function, it takes a direction. So do you want to rotate to the right or to the left? And then it rotates in that direction. Basically gets the current rotation. It calculates the new rotation based on that. So the new rotation is the current rotation plus a value that will be different based on the direction. So if you want to go to the right, it will increase 180 to the current rotation. But if you want to go to the left, it will decrease 180. And then it just sets the host element style transform property into rotate y with this new rotation degree. And so I use this function in the other two functions that we're going to go over now, which are the increment and decrement. So increment is the function that gets called every time that we click on the increment button. So here I'm listening to all the click events on increment and calling the increment function. And decrement is the function that gets called whenever we click on the elements with the class decrement. So here, decrement elements with the class decrement get an event listener on the click event that calls the function decrement. Now, how do those functions work? Increment, first, it just increases the current value by 1. So I'm using plus to do that. Gets the current face, figures out what is the other face based on the current face, and then uses the host element query selector to get the input value in the other face, which it will be turning to, and updates it to be the current value. So imagine that you're in the current face, you're showing the value 200. When you click plus, you don't want to change the current face to 201. You want to set the back face to 201 and then turn. That's how we get the cool effect. So this is what we're doing here. We get the other face, we get the input on the other face, and we set its value to the current value, which was already increased by 1 here. And then we rotate it to the right using the function that I explained earlier. We also call activate face on the other face, so that the face that was facing forward becomes deactivated and the face that we are turning to becomes activated. A last accessibility thing, we move the focus to the new face. Like, imagine that you're focused on the increment button on the front face. When you click on it, we have to move the focus to the plus to the increment button, but now on the back face. Otherwise, if we don't have that, then what happens is, here, I'm going to focus from the keyboard. Where is it? Where am I focusing on? Like, I lost the focus, and I had the focus on the plus sign, but now I lost it because it turned. Now, if we keep it, then when it turns, it moves the focus to the same element, but on the other face. So minus will be focused on the minus, but now on the other face. And that's the same thing that happens for the decrement function. Like, it's the same thing, but instead of incrementing, it decreases the value by 1 instead of increasing the value. And it rotates to the left. But other than that, everything else is the same. That was it. That's how this whole magical thing works. I know that this was a lot. Sorry if I went a little bit over the topic. Actually, I wanted your feedback on that. Like, do you like the fact that I talk about all those things in detail, or do you prefer just the main content, because the main content in this video was just the CSS magic, like the 3D in the CSS and doing the animation and etc. Would you want the video to be just that, or do you like that I talk about all the details and how everything works, including the secondary functionalities? Let me know in the comments below. Again, if you want to learn all those things that I know about web animations, consider checking out my course on web animations at lucaspaganini.com/webanimations. Also, if by any chance your company is looking for remote designers and web developers, consider checking out Unvoid.com. I am the CEO of this company, so if you liked my content, if you like this video, then I'm pretty sure that you will like the quality of what we do. All those accessibility details, making it aesthetic, making it smooth, and like actually doing it align with the brand of your project. These are all things that we take into consideration in all the projects that we work on. So if you want to have like an awesomely done project, then talk to us at Unvoid.com. We can either extend a staff that you already have, or you can completely outsource your project to us, whatever works best for your needs. Okay? That's it for today. All the links are in the description. For you that stayed up until the last second, comment #CSS just so that I know that you stayed up until the end, and I will appreciate that very much. Thank you. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.